Hello and welcome back to the Elegant Simplicity podcast series. I'm Nick Richmond, the Director of Design for Tricordant, and in this episode, we're turning our attention to a force that shapes everything in an organization and what it does, often silently. That is culture. So in earlier podcasts, we've explored how complexity accumulates, how leaders struggle to stop things, and how additive habits creep in over time. But today, we're asking a different question. What does your culture reward? Is it simplicity or complexity? Tim, welcome. It's great to have you with us. I think we met when you were a VP of People and Culture at Jazz Pharmaceuticals a little while ago. And we've been talking all things AI, operating models, and culture ever since. So before we get into this podcast, why don't you introduce yourself?
Yeah, thank you, Nick. And I'm really excited to be talking about this topic with you today because it's something that I'm very passionate about. My background is essentially in organizational design, development, and change, and I'm a specialist in that area. I've spent most of my life in big corporates, a lot of that in pharmaceutical organizations, large and small. So it's going to be a pleasure today just to share some of my insights, my experiences, and hopefully have a good conversation together.
Fantastic. I'm looking forward to it. So we asked you to write a blog for the Elegant Simplicity series, and in it you wrote a statement, and I'll quote it. It says something like, the ways things get done around here either implicitly reward simplicity or complexity. So if we start there, when you look back across your career in pharma, what were the biggest cultural signals that complexity was being rewarded?
Yeah. Well, I gave that quote or that description because I know culture itself, right? There's a huge debate around, well, what is culture and how does it show up? But I think if you simply think of it of the way that things do get done in organizations and what you experience, then I guess I've seen a number of things over the years that sometimes actually signal simplicity, but actually more often than not signal, I think, complexity and a sort of mindset that brings complexity into organizations. So I guess some obvious examples, and I know these aren't just actually examples you'll see in pharma. I'm sure you see similar symbols or artifacts in other organizations, but I guess the ones that we can all have a bit of a laugh about, but actually do signal sometimes that complexity is valued in the culture are things like the huge pre-read deck that has to be generated before a management meeting, SOP, standard operating procedures that run into pages and pages and pages of detail that are almost impossible to make sense of as a normal employee in an organization. Performance management systems that get used, whether it's an OKR, your objective setting, and actually sometimes even in the way that those systems are designed, it implies actually that the organization values complexity because it requires you to put in 15 objectives for your annual performance management, which is frankly a bit crazy. So there are sort of those overt, if you like, signals that suggest that complexity is valued. And then I think it is in the day-to-day behaviors and actions of leaders that most often you get that sense of what's valued in this organization, and leaders and the shadow they cast in an organization really give you some more clues and insights around the culture.
Yeah. No, I get that. And I certainly recognize that in the various parts of the public sector that I work in, as well as other sectors that we work across. Certainly this idea that it's a norm rather than something explicitly said. But there's an expectation for perfection. We cannot make a decision unless we know everything about this decision we're about to make. And Jeff Bezos is quoted as saying something like, you can only work 70% of that information before you need to make a decision. If you wait any longer, the opportunities pass by. Yeah, so I certainly get that.
Yeah.
So why do you think culture plays such a defining role in whether an organization becomes simple or complex?
Well, I'm a huge believer that actually culture does shape an awful lot. And when it comes to complexity or simplicity, I think it's certainly true. And for me, culture, if you boil it down again to its simple terms, it is about how people relate and communicate to one another and essentially make decisions in an organization. Mm-hmm. So it's this sort of sometimes invisible, if you like, force that sort of is shaping the social fabric of an organization. And therefore, that's got so much power and influence over how I might think or feel at any moment, because I'm either going to be feeling that I might get rewarded for behaving in a certain way or actually punished in a certain way. There could be consequences if I'm not adhering to the expected cultural norms. So for me, I think, culture is at the heart of this question. Leadership, therefore, becomes really central to I think what we're talking about today, and the shadow that leaders cast in organizations through their behaviors, because it's really the leadership that should demonstrate what they're paying attention to, what's getting measured, what's getting rewarded, and what's getting punished in organizations, which is why it's such a powerful force.
And it just reminds me again of some of those org design models and org development models that we often use. One of them being the Galbraith Star model. And if you look at how it's shaped, you've got strategies, structure, processes, people, rewards, but then the output of that is behavior and performance culture. But those things wrap themselves back around to affect the whole. And so culture is an emergent property of the system, which means that culture both affects how we design and the changes to the system that we make, and then the culture is changed by that system in itself. And so it's a self-reinforcing thing. So if you have a natural tendency towards complexity in your culture, then you're going to design for complexity unintentionally, even though you may be thinking about, let's try and reduce that. It's just part and nature of who you are. And so that underlying bias can be sat there. And I'm just thinking of Edgar Schein's sort of basic assumptions that often impact on people and how they show up and how they operate within a workplace.
Yeah, I love that, Nick, and I agree with you. And I think sometimes culture's maybe only shown as an output, but I think what you're saying, and I agree with, is a dynamic process, right? We're shaping culture every moment of every day in organizations and being shaped by the culture. So it is that interplay, and actually then the work of the organizational design or development specialist or the leader in an organization is to be able to sort of spot those patterns, cultural patterns that might be reinforcing complexity in this example, and be able to see that and disrupt that pattern if it's not adding value to the organization fundamentally, which I think you and I will argue today. There are many examples where unnecessary complexity actually gets in the way of organizational performance. But it's not to say some complexity, we're talking about the pharma industry today in particular. That is a complex industry, like many are, with regulations, highly scientific, given the nature of the work that's being done. So all of that, it is complex. It's complex stuff that we're dealing with, but it doesn't mean that the organization needs to be unnecessarily complex to deal with the complexity of the business.
Yeah, no, amen to that. So let's move on then. And when we look at culture, you and I know that culture isn't this monolithic thing that's the same everywhere. And if you think about various organizations, whether you're manufacturing or whether you in the civil service or local authority, healthcare, financial services, or wherever it is, there are different cultures across the business. And those different functions can reinforce or challenge the complexity depending on habits, beliefs, decisions, routines, as we've already started to unpick. So the question I have is, how do leaders navigate those different microcultures rather than just being pulled apart by them? What are the things that they could do to navigate between these things?
Yeah. Well, I think the first step is to do what you've done, which is acknowledge the existence of microcultures. And again, in the example of a pharmaceutical organization, you've obviously got microcultures within that, so they could be the dominant ones, and obviously sort of things like an R&D culture versus commercial, like very different set of activities, expertise in your organization. But then you also have other microcultures within R&D and within commercial. So I think we have to always, again, without overcomplicating or making this too complex ourselves, acknowledge that there is that diversity of mindset in an organization. But at a macro level, if I think about what I've observed, is typically your commercial, sales and marketing functions sort of bring more of a mindset of pragmatism, action, getting stuff done. So often that privileges, in my experience, quantity over quality of work. So there's this desire for progress and getting stuff done and a lot of activity.
But activity over value in some respects, right?
Sometimes, yes. And I think actually those commercial areas could benefit from taking a more scientific approach, using more data to analyze what they're doing, rather than just this constant sense of bias for action and getting stuff done, the busyness that gets created. But then on the flip side, if you do look at it sometimes in R&D organizations, then I can see that sort of paralysis because of just an overwhelming desire for more data. Let's analyze this process or this situation even more, and the constant additional demand for new insight, additional insight, and just end up creating incredibly complex work in the organization, which then people struggle to really deliver against. So I think there is this spectrum, and again, as a HR professional, right, that's where I've spent my career. Even within a function like HR, you can see sort of both microcultures and mindsets playing out. Sometimes I think HR at one end maybe can act too simplicity. It's all about gut feel, judgment, our expertise, and just get on and get stuff done. But then on the other end, sometimes I think we can be very guilty of creating incredibly complex job architectures or performance management systems or reward frameworks, which, again, most employees sometimes look at these things and just can't make sense of them. So, you see a bit of both playing out.
Yeah, certainly see that. So I think the other thing to help leaders navigate between these different cultures is to have a clear sense of self and how you show up in those different cultures, and being kind of empathetic to others and how you can communicate and work with them. So adapting how you interact, adapting how you communicate to get the best out of each of those. And we've only kind of touched on two cultures, microcultures, and we know that there's lots and lots of different ones in various organizations. And I think the other thing is really aligning around clarity and purpose, and creating those safe spaces where people can be themselves, but also recognizing that they need to adapt to collaborate well together with others so that you can have that win-win. So I think those are some of the other things that I'd probably add into that.
Yeah.
So something that really stands out across our research and experience is that complexity isn't just inconvenient, it's often quite costly. And we see it across multiple sectors. We've got more layers, more approvals, more committees, more dashboards, more reporting. And I think you said a few other things earlier on. And yet, as you know, from the years inside pharma, this often happens with good intent. People believe they're adding rigor, quality, safety, or even just to improve collaboration.
Yep.
But these additive habits create that steady increase of organizational complexity because leaders can struggle to say no or stop initiatives. So, Tim, if we were to use a simple design framework like the Galbraith STAR model, where do you see complexity most often creeping in, and how does it start to shape behavior over time?
Yeah, well, actually, I think the Galbraith STAR model is a great place to start. And actually, as we know, at the sort of top of that star, and the most important place where I think complexity can start to creep in is in that strategy piece, right? So quite often how I see that in organizations is essentially a lack of strategic clarity, or the way that strategic intent gets communicated to the organization is really broad and doesn't give enough clarity around, well, what's actually important to deliver against that strategy. So one that I see often, and it's not just in pharma, but when you ask a leader, so what's your strategy? Well, it's about growth. Okay, yes, that's an outcome that you're trying to achieve, but actually growth in itself as a strategy doesn't help members of an organization say, well, how are we going to actually achieve that?
What do we mean by this? Yeah,
exactly. So it's so broad, and many strategies are, that you end up saying, well, anything can fit under that strategy, which creates complexity, because then we're all trying to do everything to drive a broad notion, or it's a strategic direction which is about creating optionality. Again, it's sort of this process which essentially, opens up activity as opposed to really helps converge on what's the most important things we need to be focusing on. So I do think that's one area. I would say the second one then, again, if you follow the star around structure, is constant restructuring, which we see many organizations, pharma and non-pharma, constantly changing their structures, sometimes for good reason, but many times perhaps for questionable reasons. But I think the impact of constant reorganizations, constant restructuring, is people moving roles, shifting roles and responsibilities, work getting designed in slightly different ways. That in itself is adding to complexity in organizations and people's ability to make sense of how I'm supposed to get my work done and who's got decision rights, etc. Even those two, if we started there, Nick, I think are pretty fundamental, and you can see complexity creep into both.
Yeah, and for me, the one that comes to mind is back to that point about perfectionism. If there's a culture of perfectionism, or even a subtle expectation of that from the leaders, before you can submit anything, it needs to cross the T's, dot the I's, been circulated with everyone, and it's got to be covers all territories before we're even going to come anywhere near deciding on it. Yeah. And in one organization, we're asked to help identify barriers and understand the employee experience, because they really wanted to move themselves into a much more high-performing culture. So what we found was the organization had developed a highly complex culture framework. I think it had won some awards as well. It consisted of 7 components. Each of these had 16 to 20 elements within those 7 components. So theoretically, it made sense. It had hugely rigorous academic underpinnings, but pragmatically, people were like, what the hell? What do I do with this? 1 or 2 people like, yeah, I can make sense of that. Good for them. But everyone else is kind of scratching their heads going, this is just too much. How do I try and exhibit all of this on a day-to-day basis? Whether you're a leader, whether you're a member of staff, how do they do this? So one of our key interventions was to simplify. From that framework, we said, okay, well, let's co-create with their people, looking at what are the 5 daily behaviors that would nurture their culture the most. And then we got them to set up a group of a cross-section of the organization to just constantly and regularly reflect on where the culture was and how they needed to adapt that, so that the 5 daily behaviors may evolve over time, but those 5 daily behaviors are the ones that they felt of the moment they're going to make the biggest difference to enable them to deliver their strategy and work in a way that is healthy and effective as a whole organization. Yeah. Now, we've been talking about multiple sectors as well as the pharma sector, and we see examples of cultures that deliberately reward simplicity. So some leaders will be expressing strategy on a single page and say, there you go, strategy on a page, plan on a page, keep it simple. In manufacturing, they talk about A3 management, so maybe 2 A4 pages, one side only, describing what they're going to be doing. Teams regularly pruning processes, again, manufacturing, obviously with continuous improvement, Lean Six Sigma, all that kind of good stuff. But you also see it in central functions where they're seeking standardization to improve clarity. around their offer, how they're going to be supporting the various business units around the organization. So these patterns directly mirror what we strive for in elegant simplicity, removing what doesn't add value, focusing on what matters most, embedding purpose and accountability into structures and processes. But if we get practical, what kinds of leadership behavior actually shift a culture towards rewarding simplification? So not just slogans, but repeated observable actions that change norms.
Yeah. I think of this sort of in two ways. I guess the collective leadership of an organization, and again, the example of setting objectives, whether it's annual objectives for a firm or longer term strategic goals and priorities, and really being ruthless about how clear and focused those goals and objectives are for the whole organization to understand, and not just and I think this is where the repeated observable action piece is important. It's not just making that grand gesture at the beginning of the year around, that's the goals and objectives for the organization, but actually leaders constantly engaging with their people throughout the year. And again, that might come down at an individual level to my own personal objectives and goals, and how my leader works with me to continually check in, review my priorities, make sure I'm focusing on, I would say, 3, maximum 5 key objectives for the year, but help me actually reprioritize as well. Because I think sometimes you get that start in January, there you go, off you run, Tim, meet me back in December. A lot happens in the course of 12 months, as we know. So that,
or 3 months.
Or 3 hours sometimes, right, in the world we live in today. So it is that, I think, general leadership practice principle of regular, open dialogue with team members, rewarding and celebrating perhaps when work's being cut out of your organization, as opposed to someone who's got, hey, I've come up with a new initiative and we celebrate that. Well, how about someone who stopped an initiative because it wasn't adding value anymore, and the leader's really celebrating that, right? Those are powerful signals around what's important here. So, those are the sorts of actions I think are the most powerful for leaders, Nick.
Coming back to the valuing value over activity. Yeah. And I've also seen it in kind of governance processes and governance boards, where often it's quite opaque and often duplicating, time-consuming, same people or slightly different variations of the same people on different boards, but no one's really clear where the decision is made, and often the decision is made outside of the formal board in the corridors, and you go, hang on, have we just wasted our time across 3 different meetings trying to come to a decision and not making a decision, and then the decision is made somewhere else? That doesn't feel very good, effective, or even fair in some respects. So I can certainly see that happening in lots of organizations.
Yes, agree.
From my experience. So one of the biggest shifts in the elegant simplicity movement is the idea that subtraction requires courage, and leaders need to be able to say no and resist the pressure to add more layers, processes, etc. That's not easy, of course, especially in high expertise, high pressure environments. We hear a lot about psychological safety, but how do you pragmatically create a climate where people feel able to challenge, prune, reduce, rather than just justify the addition?
I'm really pleased that you sort of brought that notion of psychological safety into this discussion, because I think you're right. I think creating those conditions where people feel safe to speak up, speak their mind, whether it be on any subject, but particularly when it comes to, if you're in a culture or a microculture where complexity is being valued more, for you to be that lone voice to speak up and say, well, hold on a minute, could we make this simpler, or could we stop that project? Particularly in an R&D setting, again, very hard, right? When you've got passionate scientists working on potential medicines for the future, to stop and kill that kind of work in an organization is really, really hard at many levels. But I think for me, one of the another industry that I've been working with recently, who obviously do this very well and create those conditions of psychological safety, is aviation. Because we know, like with all of the accidents over the years, it's about human factors, and often psychologically unsafe environments, either in the flight deck or between the flight deck and then your cabin crew. And I think there's a lot of parallels there, and a lot of things that the aviation industry do very well now in terms of helping sort of essentially break down power differentials, so that, you know, if you're the captain and I'm the co-pilot, well, I feel that I might need to challenge you, Nick, on a decision you're making. So I think some of the same principles, and very practically, what could that look like? Well, in organizations, you know, some of the work we do with leaders and their teams would be things like a fishbowl exercise, where you mix the leaders and people of the organization in the conversation at the same time. So it's not that the leaders are dominating, or you're basically breaking down those power differentials, or exercises that challenge this notion of we've got infinite resource in our organization, we can do anything we want. Well, actually, again, really simple exercise where you give a group, let's say, 100 coins and a certain set of activities, and you say, well, you can only distribute, you've got a finite amount of time, energy, money, resources you can put into all of this work. Where are you going to put it? Because you haven't got 101 coins or 110 or 150, you know, and so very simple stuff, but actually that helps really create clarity and simplicity for everyone.
Yeah, and I think I'd also add in what we said and reinforce what we said slightly earlier. It's been really clear what is the strategic objectives and where the boundaries are, because everyone's really clear on that. Then there's less uncertainty, and people are able to say, well, I know that's in and out, and so they have a clearer view. But then equally allowing people to speak up and to say, hang on, this isn't making sense to me. And if it's not making sense to me, then how am I going to be able to explain that to my colleagues, my peers, or my reports? And particularly on the front end side of things, where you're working with salespeople, they cannot articulate something clearly to the clients, and they're just not going to do it. So there's got to be that real sense of clarity and giving people time and space to ask questions without them feeling silly in any way. So that's a great way of just creating space and allowing those conversations to flow.
Well, yeah, and you haven't used the word empowerment, but what I sense from that is that's an incredibly empowering act, right? If you have few simple rules and boundaries, that is the most empowering thing you can do for an organization, because, as you say, people are clear on those are the boundaries, but they've got a lot of room to act around those boundaries. So I really like that, Nick. Yeah. So I think that also brings us on to how leaders show up and being able to spot their own biases and the cultural habits that are keeping complexity alive. Because often it's the leaders and a few people that they work with that design these ways of working, their operating models, and often that makes it harder for them to spot, because they've built in their own biases and how they see the world. So how can leaders genuinely see the wood from the trees, and how can they spot their own biases? What is the kind of work that you'd suggest that leaders need to do themselves? Yeah, I mean, this fundamentally requires, that self-awareness and awareness of the system, which isn't always easy. We all have blind spots, and we know that. So I guess for me, it's things like, start with yourself first. A very sort of practical example I'd give you this morning is, I'm guilty of wearing the smartwatch and looking at my watch every morning for it to tell me if I had a good night's sleep last night, right? So get as much data as I can. And my watch this morning was telling me, you've had a really poor night's sleep, right, on various levels. And yet I woke up and actually felt really refreshed and fine this morning. And so almost that check step to go, well, hold on a minute, going to trust my intuition here rather than the watch. So at one level, but I guess inside organizations, how might you do that? Psychometrics, Hogan assessments, things like this actually can help sometimes to illustrate those blind spots that we might not know we have, but actually doing a formal psychometric can help you learn that. I often have found if you bring in outsiders into your department, your function, your organization, very helpfully, Lean Six Sigma experts on processes. We certainly use that in former organizations in the HR area where we would bring in manufacturing experts in process design to actually take a look at the way that we were designing processes and actually, really help to simplify what were quite complicated and complex processes. So I think there's a number of ways, but somehow you've got to be able to have that mirror held up and be willing to look in the mirror and see things that don't necessarily connect with your worldview, your mindset. So what about you? Have you seen any examples?
Yeah, no, I was coming to that as well, about holding the mirror up and allowing others to hold the mirror up. So there has to be a sense of vulnerability. Whether you call it vulnerability or whether you call it courage, you need to be able to look within and recognize what's going on for yourself and how that is impacting people around you. And it may be that you've got some imposter syndrome, or maybe it's something else, because you're in a powerful position where you're expected to make a decision that could affect people's jobs.
Yes.
It could be a patient or a group of patients that you could affect, like you say, R&D, and you have to make a decision. But you've got to see what's going on within yourself and how you're showing up and how that's going to affect people around you. And if you show up in a way that is not conducive to enabling good, safe, honest conversations, then people are going to sense it. You won't need to even say words. They'll just go, I don't feel safe here. Something's going on here, and I'm just going to keep stum and we'll let whatever be may be. And so I think that you do need to do the work yourself, and it takes time and effort. And that's often a problem with many organizations and leaders, is because the pressure is on. It's get stuff delivered, to keep on moving. Let's do the next thing. And just before you've even finished the last thing, you've got another thing on your plate to move on with. But I think you've got to create that space. And that's comes back to being able to say no. So actually, I'm not going to do that because I need time to reflect. I need time to adapt, because we all need to change over time. And part of that is looking within, understanding what's going on within ourselves, how we show up for others, and how we relate to others. So I can certainly see how that has developed in my own life as well. Yeah. And it kind of connects into the next part or next question in my mind. And of course, my mind has tenuous links everywhere, so it may not make sense to everyone. But in about a month's time, I'm hosting a webinar talking about moving from bureaucracy to clarity, and this is particularly focused on the civil service. But I'm just thinking about clarity and consistency. And so, Tim, what are some of the effective ways of organizations can build that culture of clarity and consistency so it's valued and reinforced?
Yeah, I see that in a couple of ways. I guess at an organizational level, things like the way information and knowledge gets structured and shared inside an organization is one of the biggest frustrations, which shows up in employee surveys, etc., around just getting your work done. And I actually have found things like the proliferation of Microsoft Teams, which many companies now use, which, in lots of ways really aid collaboration. But yeah, sometimes you just get lost in Teams channels and you're part of this channel, but not that channel. So in the way that information now is getting structured and organized and shared actually can make it really hard, very untransparent, so that clarity, and there might be an opportunity for HR, the technology functions to really be thinking about these things more together. Your internal communications function, if you have those in your organization, can be a really powerful force in terms of how they bring clarity or not. I've seen some great intranets, some terrible intranets, but, a head of communications who's really laser focused on noise reduction, broad kind of notion, I think I've seen work really powerfully in one company. And I think the third bit maybe that's more about a day-to-day behavior or action culturally is, and you mentioned about decisions and how decisions get made. this piece around explaining why a decision has got made. So sometimes, leaders are like, oh, well, people are just upset because they didn't get the decision they want. In my experience, actually, that's not the issue. And in fact, by not explaining why you've made a decision, it's not that people aren't going to like the decision you've made. They just don't understand, well, what was the rationale behind you making that decision? That really sort of smacks in the face of clarity, right? Because people are confused. They just can't make sense of, I don't understand why that decision was made, not the decision itself.
Yeah, and it kind of links to, again, maybe a tennis one, to a paper that we produce on our website, which says people don't resist change, they resist loss. Resist loss. And so it's really thinking about, well, if people are unsure what it is, then are they assuming there's some type of loss for them? And then they're going to go, hang on, I'm not up for this. But having that clarity of conversation, really reinforcing this is what it is, this is what it isn't. And one of my rules of thumb is communication is like a black hole. You can never fill it. And so particularly in transformation, so when you're moving through change, just think you need 7 times the amount of communication than you do as in a standard business as usual, because there's so much uncertainty. Everything's moving so quickly. You've got to keep that persistent drip feed of communication coming through, even if it's just saying there's been no new updates. The next update will be this day. And people go, okay, that's when it's coming. Otherwise, the rumor mill spins up. And you've got a lot of people then starting off different conversations about what is or isn't, hypothesizing. Some of that becomes true, even if it isn't true. And so you then play whack-a-mole for the rest of the time. And that's no fun. No one wants to play whack-a-mole. So that's constant drip feed of communication and being really clear what is and isn't happening. I think that's so important. And I'm one for openness and transparency. So I'd rather engage people in conversations. And some of the work that we've done, even when people's jobs were up and needed to be changed, or they may even be up for redundancy, we've had them in the workshops rather than excluding them.
Yeah.
And I remember once where, I get kind of hair on the back of my neck kind of stands up where I watch some of these people. They're saying, actually, they're drawing on the flip charts and they're drawing the new organization and they say, actually, you don't need me anymore. And they put their own name on the at-risk register. And then they continue the work. Those are the people that you probably really want to keep. Those are the people that are already working with you in an adult-to-adult way and taking the organization forward. Of course, in that particular situation, the operating director said, everyone is going to be looked after no matter what happens. So that was a great coming back to that safe place and psychological safety. So really reinforcing that again. So let's pull all of this into one challenge for leaders then as we close. If elegant simplicity requires the right design, the right operating model, and the right leadership behaviors, what is the single most important mindset shift leaders need to make if they want their culture to reward simplicity rather than complexity?
It sounds like you want a silver bullet, to quote our friend Steve Hearsom, and I don't know that I can give everyone a silver bullet. But I guess, look, if you really boil it down, and by the way, this is not easy because I think there is this sort of common sense view in life generally, as well as in business, that growth is good. We've got infinite growth potential, and therefore, and I know you've written in some of your blogs, Nick, about the additive mindset. So it's sort of ingrained in most of us that that's a good thing. But I think if we can really challenge ourselves as leaders, if we're holding that assumption right now that value is added by adding, that's the mindset I think we've got to fundamentally question ourselves and say, well, actually, maybe remove what's no longer adding value is a more helpful mindset to be carrying, and perhaps even further, less is more in an organizational setting. Then I think you can get to a place where you're creating, and I love what you said earlier, sort of those minimal rules, the minimum expectations with clarity, that really helps an organization perform to its maximum potential, right? Ultimately. So very easy to say, very difficult perhaps to do. And I put myself in that camp sometimes as well.
Yeah. And again, comes back to how the culture is and how the other leaders show up and what the expectations are. Because if you're in a space in which that's difficult to do, then it will take a lot longer. And I remember chatting to a head of org development in a very large research organization. And she was saying it took her 5 years to help them adapt and nurture their culture to be one that was quite different from when she started. It's not a quick fix. It takes time, takes effort. It's ongoing work. It's kind of formal work and workshops and meetings and documents, but it's also the informal work, talking to people along the corridors, over lunches and dinners and all that kind of stuff and everything.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so Tim, thank you so much. This has been a thoughtful and grounded conversation. And to our listeners, culture isn't decoration. It's a system of signals that shapes everything else. We want organizations that are simple, adaptive, and human-centered, and so cultures where elegant simplicity becomes real. Join us next time as we continue exploring elegant simplicity. Thank you.
Thank you.